The Epps plantation at City Point, Virginia, was once the largest in the country, occupying more than 2,300 acres in and around the confluence of the James and Appomattox rivers, about 20 miles south of Richmond. But all things fall to weather and war, and while he couldn't know it at the time, Captain Francis Epps, patriarch of the plantation that bears his name, had managed to plant his flag and family fortune in 1635 at a collision point in American history. As Union troops approached in 1864, Thomas Epps stood on the veranda of Appomattox Manor, the ancestral home he had helped rebuild and expand, and said his silent goodbyes, taking his family and whatever they could carry south about 20 miles to what he thought was the relative safety of Petersburg, Virginia. War would take its toll, he must have thought, but perhaps the family might eventually rebuild. Yet nothing Dr. Epps imagined might befall his home could come even close to what Union troops had in mind for Appomattox Manor and City Point. Major General Rufus Ingalls, chief quartermaster of the Union's Army of the Potomac, was a single-minded man with a reputation for making things happen. In the months following Ingalls' arrival at Appomattox Manor, City Point and the environs around it would become, for a time, the largest and busiest port in the world. Where pastures, crepe myrtles, and magnolias had reigned for more than a century, miles of railroad ties and iron spikes would take their place, as would hundreds of finger docks with bigger piers for bigger ships, deliveries of almost 1 million board feet of lumber and more pouring in every day, and an army of engineers, soldiers, and workmen, mighty enough to make it all a reality. It would take Ingalls less than 30 days to turn City Point into a Union supply depot so massive it would have stunned Confederate commanders had they been able to see it. Despite its strategic importance, the property in and around the manor house wasn't a perfect fit for a military supply depot. The point where the two rivers intersected was mostly mudflats and shallow water. Anything deep enough for supply ships and beanie side wheel steamers was a good 10 yards or more from the shoreline on either the James or the Appomattox sides of the point. But Ingalls and his staff were undeterred. Eventually, there would be more than 21 miles of rail lines crisscrossing the property and linking up to major Union supply lines, all headed to the Eastern Front for the final battles of the Civil War. At its busiest times, there were as many as 200 ships a day ready to offload their cargo or moor up in deep water until there was space at one of the main piers. Then there were the incredible stores of supplies. More than 3,000 wagons, 2,000 field ambulances, 600,000 tons of food, and 6,500 horses and mules. In addition, a series of field hospitals would spring up, and a bakery capable of delivering 100,000 loaves of hot bread every day to the front lines. All in, what Ingalls built enabled 24 locomotives to deliver more than 1,400 tons of supplies every day to the battlefield. For security, Ingalls had small forts built and troops garrisoned at the outer perimeter of the always expanding installation. But it wasn't enough to stop an enterprising John Maxwell and the Confederate Secret Service from infiltrating the property and planting in a cargo ship full of ordnance one of the very first timed incendiary bombs. The device proved deadlier than Maxwell could have imagined. More than 80,000 pounds of gunpowder ignited in a spectacular explosion, killing 40 men and hurling pieces of maintenance buildings, wooden docks, shards of glass, iron implements, and human body parts for thousands of yards. Equally spectacular was the fact that repairs to the docks and other facilities damaged in the blast were made in just 10 days. City Point kept moving outward and upward, always taking over more land and homes. Ingalls Machine, it seemed, was consuming everything in its path. Chronicling much of the great transformation at City Point were a small cast of photographers, including the famous Matthew Brady. But none were as prolific in capturing the engineering feats of Ingalls Machine as a 34-year-old artist turned infantry soldier from Nunda, New York, named Andrew J. Russell. By the time he reached City Point in 1864, Russell was already an experienced photographer and had been mustered out of infantry duty to officially document the war full-time for the Union Army. But it was at City Point that Russell learned a new process of developing images from portrait photographer Egbert Guy Fowix, who built a ramshackle studio on the grounds at the supply depot where soldiers could have their pictures taken to send home. But it was Russell, and earlier Richard Epps, in the daily diary he kept while expanding his plantation, that gave historians a clearer picture of what happened at City Point, how everything came to be, and what was left when all the fighting was finished. Despite different stations in life and political differences, Epps and Russell had much in common. Both enlisted in their respective services at the war's early stages. Epps with the rank of private in the cavalry, Russell an infantry captain. Both were lovers of the exacting arts. An on-again, off-again contract surgeon for the Confederacy, Epps was drawn to the science of fertilizers and crop rotation more than medicine. Russell was fascinated by the alchemy and emerging science of photographic image development. But their biggest commonality was in documenting what was, for them, a world at war. By early 1865, Union Commander Ulysses Grant had taken up residence at City Point to direct the continuing assault on Petersburg. Grant and his family lived in one of the small cabins that lined 2 rows adjacent to Appomattox Manor's south side entrance. But no doubt, he stalked the wooden porches of the big house, lit cigar in hand, peering out over the rivers, a moment's solace in the grinding work of war. So perhaps did Lincoln, on 2 of his visits to City Point, the last one less than a week before Lee surrendered, and the president visited Ford's Theater in Washington. At the back of the house, the sidewheel steamer River Queen was where Lincoln worked and slept. The ship was also the location of what some have called the Yalta Conference of the James, where Lincoln met with Admiral David Dixon Porter and Generals Grant and Sherman to discuss what he hoped would be generous terms of surrender should Confederate generals agree to lay down their swords. When the war did end, Lincoln's hope for a compassionate reconstruction ended with it. The president left City Point in April 1865, and about a week later was assassinated in Washington. A vengeful Secretary of War and U.S. Congress began what was to be a long, bitter, and punishing reconstruction for the South, something the Epps family would get a taste of in short order. Ingalls Machine was disassembled by 1866, and with almost as much speed as it had gone up. When Richard Epps finally returned to his plantation, he found a desecrated wasteland and a family home that had fallen into extraordinary disrepair. Many of the cultivated areas of the plantation were overgrown with weeds, and most, if not all, of the 127 slaves that had borne the misery and labor of building Epps's agricultural empire were gone. Epps chronicled the situation in his diary.
It was desolation personified, a perfect waste, not a house, fence, timber tree, or scarcely tree of any kind standing. Everything, more than 500 acres of woodland cut down and totally destroyed.
The family's furniture was gone too, but the remnants of Ingalls Machine were everywhere.
All my old buildings still standing, and my own dwelling house repaired, which had been nearly destroyed during the McClellan campaign in 1862. The grounds around my dwelling house were filled with many little huts, having been the headquarters of General Grant during the campaign around Petersburg.
Surrounded by chaos, Epps could change nothing, as the temporary buildings and other equipment, even his home, had been confiscated as government property. Worse, he had no authority to evict any of the individuals living on the property, even those in his old home, nor take steps to close facilities that had sprung up in his absence, including a house of prostitution that employed both white and black working girls. Epps sought government help to shoulder the expense of the cleanup. Citing his wealth, Washington refused, leaving the family, day laborers, and neighbors to clear away piles of wooden debris and hulks of iron that had been abandoned in the wake of the war's end. Nothing was ever the same again for Thomas Epps and his family. The plantation would never again function as successfully as it had, although it would expand into neighboring Prince George County. On January 1866, Epps purchased his property back from the government for $641.50, an amount considered then to be more than fair market value. But he still didn't have complete control of his lands, as the 58th Pennsylvania Regiment, Epps wrote, proved to be an especially disorderly group, more an armed mob than anything else. The village of little huts Epps had encountered, save the one that had been Grant's cabin, were all removed from the property. The general's cottage was packed up and sent to Philadelphia for display, but a small percentage of its original wood was used in the construction of a life-size model, now on display at Appomattox Manor. Today, the property is once again the tranquil place Epps, Grant, Lincoln, and others had marveled over, looking out as it does over the wide expanses of the windswept James and Appomattox rivers. The manor house and outbuildings have been restored several times, the last, ironically, by the federal government that had 114 years earlier turned away Epps's pleas for help. The only sentries still standing watch over the place are the vultures which cling to the manor house's chimneys, as if no one bothered to tell them all the killing is finally over.